Do you remember how back in the day just about every movie got a video game tie-in? Most of these games weren't good by any means, but of course there have been a hefty amount of them that managed to be, well, not necessarily great, but certainly above average. The video game adaptation of The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser isn't one of these above average games. In fact, it may be one of the worst movie video games I have personally ever played, though I'm sure that I will be experiencing worse in the future. As of now, this game was honestly so bad, and it left such an awful taste in my mouth that I found it difficult to even write this review on it. So if possible, I'd like to put this game out of its misery as quickly as I can. Before we begin, I'd like to state that you need to have at least watched the movie before watching this video, which I'm sure you've seen anyway since it's like 20 years old now and a classic. The story of the Mummy game is as you expect and follows the plot of the movie. Except it doesn't. Rather than introducing important characters such as the American grave robbers or the sweaty prison warden guy, we're stuck with only the main trio, O'Connell, Evie, and Jonathan, while also seeing a few appearances from Ardith Bay, Benny, and IMHOTEP. To make matters worse, there is no mid-story traveling to Thebes like in the movie or a playable version of the riverboat scenes. Nah, the entire game just takes place in the tombs of Hymenoptera. Did I forget to mention that the game takes place at about the halfway point of the movie where IMHOTEP is resurrected? We don't get any chance to explore the prior character introduction and development, and it's obvious that the game expects you to have already watched the movie. The sense of adventure given off by the movie is completely absent here, and even to someone who absolutely loved the film, the characters in the game in general felt like they were completely separate entities and only bore the same likeness as the film. While the half-assed plot of the game could have been, I guess, saved by some equally half-assed storytelling, not even that could be done.
Hey! Get your ugly face away from her!
The only storytelling that we have are two clips from the film that played during the beginning and ending of the game that I obviously cannot show you since Universal is run by a bunch of shitheads who will copy strike me through my neighbor's butt cheeks 3 houses down. Plus I'm already at risk by having the film's music in this video. And little bits of exposition and or ridiculous filler in between levels or during these horribly out of place loading screens when what I guess is supposed to be a poorly rendered Oded Fair lookalike warns you about IMHOTEP'S abilities.
You may have killed us all. You have unleashed a creature that we have feared for more than 3,000 years.
Without a decent or even coherent story, The Mummy's nothing but a mindless slogfest that I found myself struggling to continue playing after the third level, only sticking with it because I love the movie so much. Gameplay wise, the game tries to be several different things and just fails at all of them. You want Tomb Raider but with shit gunplay and platforming, here you go. How about some clunky side-scrolling pitfall-like segments with terrible hitboxes? Or my personal favorite, the little parts where you gotta go log surfing in a precursor to Subway Surfers or something. Level designs are incredibly lazy and uninspired, save for this one single location that matched the one in the film, being the little revolving trapdoor that led to Evie first meeting IMHOTEP, which ended up being the coolest thing in the entire game to me. Each level is just a repetitive trek through a dark tomb full of bullshit traps that you're guaranteed to die from whether you actually avoid them or not. Very poorly laid out platforming segments, and don't forget tons of ridiculous gank fights involving the pretty small and boring variety of mummies in the game, followed by the occasional log surf or sideways run. The objective of each level is to simply reach the end and retrieve one of usually 3 items that are used to progress the game's story. For no reason whatsoever, you're brought to a weird hub level for some dumb cutscene or to just run to the opening for the next level to do the same thing all over again. The game is divided to 3 separate hubs with 3 levels involving retrieving a certain item, along with 4 boss levels. If you manage to gather all of the typical game collectibles, in this case treasure pieces, ammunition, and health vials, while also breaking every breakable item and lighting these stupid hieroglyphics with your torch in every single level, you can actually unlock a bonus level that takes place during the boat scene and ends up with you fighting through Cairo. But I promise you, you'll think this game is so bad that you won't even attempt to bother with that. To make matters worse, this game seriously controls like ass. Like I said earlier, you get Tomb Raider but after it's been pulled from the sewer after being flushed like your childhood goldfish. I really don't need to go into detail about the segments that involve a different style of gameplay since they aren't super prevalent. Seeing that this run and gun platformer style of gameplay is the main attraction, you'd think that more work would have been placed into refining it. The game is marred by technical issues that need some mentioning before the mechanical ones. As I mentioned earlier, when talking about the side-scroller segment, the game's hitboxes are ridiculously large to the point of being hit by enemies that seem to be out of reach, or being insta-killed by traps that you clearly jumped over or behind. When running through a level, be prepared to just be stopped by literally nothing and watch O'Connor run in place for a couple of seconds or come to a certain point on a terrain or platform that isn't a wall, but it acts like a wall. When it comes down to the gameplay itself, be prepared to die. A lot. When you pair this with the previously mentioned issues, What should have been a 4-hour game ended up being an 8-hour one, full of frustration and lots of rage-induced F-bombs. I can't count how many times the clunky, heavy-ass tank controls caused me to die repeatedly on certain platforming sections because how easy it is to completely overshoot a jump or miss it entirely. Being able to hang on to ledges is very hit or miss, considering half the time you try to jump up to grab one, nothing happens. Or you just end up going off in a completely different direction that you did not intend to. Another thing that really impacts the platforming parts of the game is the horrible camera. While yes, you can control it, it still likes to be very janky and will require constant adjustment. With the way that things went for me, I felt that a good chunk of the levels are meant to be completed via means of trial and error, especially during the few times that you need to navigate through the rooms with falling pillars. The combat aspect of the mummy is a little more manageable since it's really easy to dispatch enemies unless you're being attacked by a large group of them, which is the case about half the time. Ranged weaponry involves dual revolvers, a shotgun that you seemingly find in a chest that's been sealed for thousands of years, and a machine gun given to you by Ardeth Bade during the final act of the game that really makes things a breeze. Throwable weapons involve these weird magical onks that do crazy damage, and some good old dynamite that should probably cause the entire place you're in to collapse, but whatever. And of course we have some melee weapons that include your trusty fist, a torch to beat stuff with, a sword, and then the golden sword from the film, which is a beast. In the end, I preferred to use the machine gun since it made quick work of the large crowds of mummies, and the golden sword or the sword weapon in general for one-on-one fights. Especially after I discovered that you can sort of Dark Souls parry an enemy and really punish them, which I thought was really neat and pretty deep for the game. But being able to block and parry melee attacks is really as deep as the combat gets, and you'll be spending the rest of your time mashing X to shoot at enemies that you automatically lock onto whilst battling with the god-awful weapon cycling menu, along with dying a lot to the many gank fights during the first 2 acts of the game. Thankfully, the boss fights and even the final battle against IMHOTEP are all pathetically easy, but still, be ready to see lots of mummies celebrating your death like it's Christmas. The next most amusing thing about the game is the running animation. The basic movement is like a jog in the park, and when you begin to sprint, it's like booking it to the bathroom with loaded pants. At this point, I'd imagine you're asking yourself if there's even anything remotely good about this game. Though really bad and boring gameplay seriously wasted any sort of potential that the game had. That's a real shame since the game boasts some pretty decent graphics and impressive audio. The first thing that comes to mind is how the levels look. Everything is usually shrouded in darkness to, I guess, give off that feeling of, well, you're in a tomb, but to also allow for more detailed visuals in a smaller area. This whole concept really reminded me of the first Silent Hill games since the fog was mainly used to prevent loading screens and also create an atmosphere. Makes even more sense considering that Konami published both Silent Hill and this game. The environments themselves are comprised of ancient caverns and tombs, ranging from being in almost pristine condition to almost falling apart. While the caverns are really muddy and hard to look at, and you kinda notice that the climbable objects like this kinda blend in with the background, the tombs are nicely textured and sport a multitude of statues and sculptures. The hieroglyphics on the wall of each level are also pretty thoroughly detailed and varied by location. It also feels like a real treat to play through the game as the movie's soundtrack is playing ambiently in the background and changes appropriately when you're engaged in combat, really taking a step in the right directions toward being like the movie. But as you can see, there's lots of weird clipping and screen tearing throughout the entire game, and you'll come to find out that the game is full of weird hazards such as lava pits or rivers of blood and just regular water to have one of those regular platformer tropes despite it making zero sense. The character models for O'Connell, IMHOTEP, and pretty much all of the mummy enemies look really good for the most part. But of course, in 1999, trying to make a video game character look like Brendan Fraser or Arnold Vosloo is pretty unlikely, so their faces are really laughable. The rest of their bodies, such as their clothing and just general proportions, are pretty spot on and accurate to the movie, especially IMHOTEP's different stages of becoming flesh again. Honestly, the same could be said for every important character except for Ardeth. I really don't know what went wrong with him. Sadly, like a majority of movie games, the stars of the Mummy did not provide their voices for the game, and in this case, I believe that's a good thing.
What have you found?
There's something written here, but it's too dark to read.
What we got instead was a bunch of people poorly attempting to imitate the cast that ended up being so incredibly cheesy that I found it hilarious. Whoever the hell this guy is that's trying so hard to sound like Brendan Fraser, thank you. This is Resident Evil levels of bad, and I love it.
Well, this is it. IMHOTEP'S chamber.
The person who plays Benny in the game actually did a decent job though. I would also love to mention that the sounds the mummy enemies make are ripped straight from the movie and make the game feel a lot more authentic, similar to how I mentioned the music earlier. However, it does get really old to constantly hear the same death noises from enemies after a while with zero variation. Being nothing more than your typical movie tie-in cash grab, The Mummy falls into the massive category of generic and lazy movie games, no matter how somewhat nice the graphics and audio are. Such a boring, shallow game isn't even worth looking at in my honest opinion, no matter how curious you are to try it. And you're seriously just better off watching the movie again instead. Maybe next time, partner. Thanks a ton for coming out and watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, and if you have anything you'd like to mention or add to whatever I said in the video, please leave a comment down below. And if you're interested in any of my previous reviews or my possible future reviews, do consider subscribing. And as always, until next time.